Mm. So I wonder then, Randall, like, what is like the default reading of scripture like look like if there is one? Because obviously there's certain passages that we'd want to take literal, like the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then especially with like your views with like Old Testament violence, like like there's no way God would command the things that at least on the face value it appears like He did. So like, how do we like discern like how to read the Bible?
Well, that's, of course, the question of hermeneutics, of interpretation. The first thing I think we have to do at the outset is to challenge the assumption that we can speak in monolithic terms about the proper interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah.
Because what the Bible, in fact, is a diverse collection of different writings written in different literary genre within distinct socio-historical contexts to original readers that are separated from us by 2,000 to 3,000 years in three languages that are not widely spoken by today's contemporary readers. So we're reading them in translation. And with that in mind, I think the outset, what we have to say is we need to dispense with the idea of the one face value approach to reading the Bible. Rather, what we need to do is to engage with every text, every genre within its particular literary context, but also recognizing that we as Christian readers are informed by particular theological assumptions that will guide our reading. So, for example, I mentioned the language of God in human terms a few moments ago. As a Christian reader who believes that God is the necessary agent cause of everything else that exists, I am going to believe at the outset that God is not literally sitting on a throne. I should also mention the literary necessary agent cause who is non-physical, right? He's spiritual, he's non-physical. So when I read God being described in human terms, I do interpret that as anthropomorphic. I do interpret it as God being described in human terms so that we can grasp something of God, but not as a literal description. Now, that is in fact a theological assumption that informs my reading of Scripture. And when I read about God seeming to command the mass slaughter of women and children and infants and the elderly in a society in a way that meets the contemporary legal definition of genocide, if I'm informed in my reading, both by, I believe, our God-given moral intuitions as to what morality is, what moral value is, and what moral obligation are, and also by who I believe God to be revealed as in Jesus, then those are also overriding assumptions to guide how I read the text. Some of them are moral intuitive, some of them are Christological, again, some of them are theological, and so on. And so when we become aware of the background assumptions by which we read texts, and we bring those background assumptions into dialogue with the text understood in its literary and sociocultural historical context, we can begin to move toward answering the question that you've posed. It's not simple, in other words.
Mm-hmm. No, I really appreciate it. And it is important to remember, like, almost like the baggage we bring into like the text. Like, I was talking with someone I care a lot about on Genesis 1, just like recently. And he's like, they're telling me, like, well, if you just read it, like, it's just obvious that it's teaching a young earth. And it's like, well, maybe from like a 21st century American context, yes. But then we have to like dive into the context of the biblical writers and what are they trying to say, not what we just think they're trying to say.
I mean, I like the way you put that, because you could read a book like Ronald Number's book. He's a historian of science. He wrote a book called The Creationists, and he points out that modern young earth creationism really arose in the early 20th century with a fellow named George McCready Price, who was a Seventh-day Adventist and a flood geologist in the 1920s. And then it was adopted by the rise of the fundamentalist movement, and then was reinvigorated in the early 1960s by the publication of a book called The Genesis Flood. And what these folks do is what we all do, is that they set up a reading tradition. And so when a person like your friend thinks, well, the natural way to read Genesis 1 and 2 is just as a straightforward literal description, what they don't realize is that they have been inculcated, they've been, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but they've learned a particular reading tradition. And every one of us has a reading tradition, whether we recognize it or not. That's why interpretation is never without presuppositions. The challenge, rather, is to become aware of the presuppositions that we have when we come to the text.